One of the most amazing video records is the actual video of the Constitutional Convention that was taken by one of the conventioneers, which was Steve McCutcheon, and that resides at the
For Americans, Alaska has always represented a vision. But for the people of Alaska, one persistent vision was to become Americans. A vision thwarted for 92 years by powerful commercial interests that ruled the territory from a distance, and a federal government that seemed at best indifferent. In 1955, Alaskans took a major step towards self-government when they wrote the Constitution they hoped would help make the territory a state. This is the story of that Constitution and how Alaskans won the right to govern themselves.
In retrospect, I think we did as good a job as could have been done. And I think that the Constitution has fully stood the test of time. It was designed to be adaptable to the future, to be a lasting document like the U.S. Constitution.
Well, it was a big gamble, except it was a gamble we had to take because we wouldn't get another opportunity. They came here because they were trying to create literally a new world based upon, let's do it right this time. That was, I heard more times at the convention. We don't care how you did it outside, that's another thing.
Kim Owen was a professor at the State University of Louisiana, and he became the consultant to the Committee on Style and Drafting. I can hear him in his southern brogue, "The language must sing." And he helped to make the language sing. The clarity and the simplicity and the directness that you see expressed in the original Constitution came largely from the work of George Sundberg and Kim Owen.
I think, not just because I was a member of it or because I'm one of the last 5 members of the Constitution, that it was a good document. I think that historians and I think people in the political arena have always said, since we got out of the convention in 1956, that it was a model convention, that it was a model structure.
heard of that through the conference today and yesterday. And that was whether it was mining or industrial development, whether it was civil rights or mental health care, which is one of my areas of study, or the harvest of fisheries, and particularly the harvest of fisheries. So, and as we are focused today on the natural resources article in our panel, we want to provide some background. We want to provide some background on that. And these historic issues do deal with real issues today, such as the taxation of our resources and who owns the resources. Kayla.
And James Wickersham actually is the first great political leader of Alaska who would articulate the need for statehood.
Some of the most powerful investors of the territorial period were J.P. Morgan and the Guggenheim brothers. Their operations included huge copper mines, a railroad to bring the copper ore to Tidewater, and shipping companies to carry the ore south. The integrated monopoly became known as the Alaska Syndicate, and by the early 20th century, it accounted for the majority of Alaska's economy. Alaskans needed the jobs the investors brought, but many resented outside control over their lives.
One of Wickersham's great foes for much of his career were the Guggenheims. Now, early on, it's a little bit confusing because he appears like he initially wanted to work for them after he actually left his judgeship. And maybe it's perhaps because they sort of spurned him that it was really Alaska. They're divided into two camps. It was the Wickersham or the Wick camp and the Goog camp. And Wickersham definitely threw himself in the anti-Goog camp.
In 1906, the U.S. Congress created the office of Alaska Delegate, a purely advisory position with no vote. 3 years later, in 1908, Wickersham ran successfully for delegate against the hand-picked choice of the Guggenheims.
Wickersham has a long record of accomplishment in his time as delegate. One of the most important was the passage of the Second Organic Act in 1912, which created the Alaska Territorial Legislature. And this was really the first time that Alaskans really had a substantial say in controlling their own affairs. The legislature did have power to levy taxes, which was a power, by the way, that the salmon can industry vigorously fought.
Throughout the territorial era, the powerful salmon canning companies made every effort to block taxation. Wickersham wrote that, "They resent the suggestion that the people of Alaska have any right or interest in the salmon or the fisheries, and they resent it when it is suggested that they pay some little portion of the tax for the building of roads or the development of the country." In 1916, Wickersham introduced in the U.S. Congress a bill to make Alaska a state, a bill that he knew had no chance of passing.
Hard to tell how serious he was about that. Is the United States Congress going to create a state where you have 30,000 citizens, most of whom are probably not permanent residents? Transiency was one of the issues that Congress always considered when it was looking at statehood. The canneries come up every May. At the end of the season, they'd take the pack and go back, and the money was actually generated in Seattle and San Francisco. And of course, the salmon industry doesn't want taxation in Alaska. They don't want more stable government. They don't want statehood because that's going to mean regulation. That's going to mean taxation. So that's a big piece of the story.
Don't know, what a lot of people don't know is that our Constitution was written before statehood, to prove to others that we could actually govern ourselves. Very little progress had been made since 1912 when Wickersham introduced his bill to the 1950s. So it was clear that there needed to be something done, and it needed to be a pretty big gamble. And it was a big gamble, as George Rogers said, because what if people got together and did a really bad job? What if they actually couldn't do a job? What would that say about us and our drive for statehood? But the people in the convention bubble came together, and they actually made the decisions. Everyday people. The way they were elected was very distributed across the state, so it wasn't on judicial districts, it was a broader system. And deciding to hold a convention outside of the capital of Juneau created an important part of the success. And that place, as we know, was the University of Alaska.
The winter of 1955 was a cold one, even by Fairbanks standards, and temperatures plummeted as the delegates trickled in from around the territory. For many statehood foes, Alaska's Constitutional Convention was just an exercise in political theater. Unauthorized by the U.S. Congress and below the radar of mainstream media, most stayed at home and ignored it.
Fact is that the media didn't show up because nobody thought we were serious. Thought we were just a group of people going through an exercise.
Not many people took the work that seriously, which is proven by the fact that there were essentially no lobbyists. There was virtually no one from the salmon canning industry, no one from the incipient oil industry at that time. They didn't show up because it really didn't have the overriding concern that, you know, they sort of wondered, is anything ever going to come of this?
The natural resource article of the Constitution. So let's play that now.
Perhaps the most important committee work would take place in the Natural Resources Committee. The delegates recognized that natural resources were the only means at that time to create an economy and pay for government. The committee came up with two unique ideas that would set Alaska apart. The first was defining who should benefit from Alaska's resources.
Article 8, the legislature shall provide for the utilization, development, and conservation of all natural resources belonging to the state, including land and waters, for the maximum benefit of its people. You won't find that in any other constitution.
The second new idea was called sustained yield. It was clearly a response to the fish trap. Renewable resources like fish, game, and timber should be used, but only at levels and in ways that ensured they were sustained.
The fish trap is a very efficient way of harvesting salmon, but the way the canneries operated, they would mine those salmon streams. For local people, this meant that these are fish that we could be harvesting with our nets, with our gear, and for the Indians, it was a disaster because they just ignored what the traditional rights of the Indians were. The Indians had no rights as far as they were concerned.
The concept of Prudhoe Bay was not even on anyone's horizon, but the resource article was written to provide a basis for any kind of resource development, and the general rules have applied very effectively to oil development in Alaska.
The Natural Resource Article of Alaska's new Constitution presented a unique approach to the unique demands of a future state, an approach meant to reverse a long history of resource exploitation.
To the minute, actually. And there was a signing in Signers Hall. And it's really important to remember that it had to pass the convention, and then it had to pass the public. And here was 55 people who didn't know each other when they got together or didn't know each other well and worked as a group. And here they did in 75 days in the middle of the winter. I don't even know if they had per diem in those days, but you know, people didn't go to long meetings because they had work at home. They had stuff to do. Like Bill Egan, he had a grocery store. As a matter of fact, Bill Egan had to hitchhike to the convention. His truck broke down, And they wanted him to be the chair, but they had to delay for 2 days till he arrived. So it was very ordinary people that wrote this document. So when we also think about the fact that they needed alignment with the governor. And the governor, Governor Greening, was appointed by the president, right? And if you think today about that relationship, Greening was all in for statehood. He probably could have been easily fired for his advocacy of statehood. And also our other major delegates, no one was, well, not no one, but many people were on the side of moving this document forward. So let's go ahead and play this clip.
On the afternoon of February 5th, Bill Egan spoke from the podium. The question was, shall the proposed constitution for the state of Alaska be agreed upon by the convention? Then he asked the chief clerk to call the roll. One at a time, all 54 delegates there said yea. One delegate had left Fairbanks and did not vote, R.E. Robertson, an attorney from Juneau who had represented the canned salmon industry.
It was so emotional at the end because it was like we'd been through, I mean, starting out with 55 different individuals who had so many of them, such wide backgrounds, and that they did come together.
By the time the overall Constitution was written, there was virtually unanimous agreement that the Constitution couldn't be better, that it's going to work for the future state.
Late in the day on February 6th, the chief clerk called the names of each delegate, beginning with Bill Egan's. One by one, the delegates affixed their signatures. After the last delegate had signed, Egan addressed the convention and commended them all for a job well done. A convention of everyday Alaskans had crafted a constitution that political scientists and scholars would later call one of the best, if not the best, state constitutions ever written. In April, the Constitution was overwhelmingly approved by Alaskan voters, along with the fish trap and Tennessee Plan proposals. That fall, Alaskans chose their Tennessee Plan delegates, and now it was on to Washington.
Was a miracle, in my opinion, that these people came together. They were able to draft something that we still use today, and we are still very proud of today. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Karen. We'll ask the panelists to come up onto the stage. So we have 4 panelists to talk about the natural resources article. When we started, we thought about trying to do a panel on the whole Constitution and realized that would take 3 days, and we only had an hour and a half. So we picked this one because, as was said in the video, this was perhaps the most important committee work of the convention. So our 4 panelists, I'll introduce them. Each one, I've asked them each to make some opening remarks, and then we'll have some questions, hopefully get some informal dialogue going among the panelists. So to begin with, we have John Coghill. You may recognize that name. You just heard it. A lifelong Alaskan and really a child of the Constitution. Grew up with his dad being one of the the delegates, and turned out to be one of the longest living delegates. John has been a businessman. He served 22 years in the State House of Representatives, was director of the Fairbanks Rescue Mission, has led an exemplary life, and I want to turn to John for some opening remarks.
Oh boy. All right, am I on all right? You hear me good? All right. So yeah, I was 5 years old when the Constitution Convention happened right here in Fairbanks. It was a cold winter, is why I understand it. So my memory is of the travel, pretty much, because twice I made it to Fairbanks with Dad in an old Chevy pickup truck, which was cold. And so I got to be at the Constitution Convention as a kid, just a little toddler. And I'll tell you what I remember. So it has nothing to do with the Constitution, candy dishes. That's what I remember. But it was true. I got to be raised in a family that was about, let's build Alaska. Let's take control of our state. And so I got to hear and see many of the things that now I remember by watching video. One of them was Nenana was on the railway, so people would come to Fairbanks and stop and talk to Dad at our little apartment. And they would sit at the kitchen table and we'd get to listen to them. And normally I wasn't paying that much attention, except for every once in a while they'd pat me on the head or something. But Bill Egan did come by, and I remember especially him coming by maybe 3 or 4 different times during that event. So I got to see that from a kid's perspective. I knew it was a big deal, but I didn't know how big a deal it was. I'm going to fast forward a lot of years. I grew up watching my dad be in politics. So he was mayor of the town. He was a constitutional convention guy, but he was also a territorial legislator, and he was a state legislator in the first state legislature. So at home, I got to hear the talk about how we're going to build and what we're going to do. The natural resources section was a big deal to him. The fish traps was a big deal to the coastal guys, but mining was a big deal to the interior guys. So I got to hear a lot about the mining. Of course, he sold groceries to people who were mining. And back in those days, placer mining was a big deal in Alaska. And so groceries was a big deal. Later on, he began to sell fuel to people who were placer miners. So I got to see that firsthand in many ways in Alaska. And the conversation quite often was, how do we make this land work for us, for Alaskans? We knew it was a small population. I didn't know how small it was, because Nenana, we had, 700 people. That was my scope of the world at that point, except for he would travel a lot. And we did get to go to the legislature when we were kids, and I got to see him in the territorial legislature. I got to see him in the state legislature. Mostly, I think I did 5th grade and 7th grade in Juneau while he was doing his work in Juneau. That's my history of remembering the big deal, because the only thing else I remember was when we did get statehood in 1960, I was 10 years old, and the parade down First Avenue, and mostly I remember going across the Chena River Bridge, which was the old Chena River Bridge, waving flags. I rode in an old car with my dad, and it was a big party. It was celebrating statehood. So that was a big memory to me. And just, in fact, I probably shouldn't even say this, but a lot of people said, let's go pee in the Chena River, make it yellow for the gold of Alaska. That's the kind of thing that I remember as a kid, right? So it was a lot of fun. Fast forward a lot of years, I got to watch Dad be in politics for a lot of years. I was not going to do that. I saw the cost to the family. We were without Dad a lot of years, where he was gone for whole winters, and Mom had to run the show, and I was the oldest boy, so I got to run the show. We ran a roadhouse He had a business. I had to fix trucks and all that kind of stuff. Heat him up here in the winter. So I wasn't going to do politics ever. Fast forward 48 years old after 2 careers. I was at a place where my legislator was not going to run, and I was out looking for people to run for office. And they said, Coghill, that's a good name. Why don't you do that? So I did. So I had to come up to speed on the Constitution. The good news is I had Dad to go to. And I can tell you, certainly Dad had his perspective that wasn't, I would say, unanimous with all the Constitutional Convention guys, but he had his perspective. And I drank deep at his well, and I got trained by him on a lot of things. He was really interested in the resource development and the local governance of towns. That was kind of his focus. And so I did learn a little bit about it. In the legislature, I had to come up to speed again. And the 2 things that I read in our Constitution, which is in Title 8, was we've got to manage our land like our forest. We have to manage it so that other people in future generations get the benefit of it. But we get to use it. But we want to manage it for a sustained yield, right? And so that's forestry, fisheries, animal management. So sustained yield was something I heard over and over and over again. In fact, while my dad was lieutenant governor, he wrote a little portion on the sustained yield management of our and I would encourage you, in fact, I have a copy of it here. It's just a little pamphlet called Alaska Constitutional Mandate on sustained yield. And so it deals with that. It also deals with another issue, and that is those things that don't regrow. That is your gold and your silver and your the things that you mine out of the ground. And it was to be used for the national use of the people of Alaska. And so this particular document was probably key to the resources development of Alaska. So when I got to the legislature as a young kid, I was probably a little more brash than I should have been, but Dad caught me by the collar a few times and taught me a little bit about this Article 8, Section 8 of the Constitution. And I think it was like this: you better. So I got the benefit of being the kid of the Constitutional Convention, but I also got the benefit to serve Alaskans. And I got to serve on the Judiciary Committee and on the Resources Committee. And in those committees, I felt responsible not only to learn what people had said at the Constitutional Convention, but how they would see us going forward, because they gave us a lot of latitude. They gave us a principle of what you want to operate on, but they let us make the decisions on how we're going to proceed. So I got to do that, and I'm glad that I've had that opportunity. The Constitution has worked.
Thank you, John. We'll turn now to Marty Rutherford. Marty's a 5th-generation Alaskan from Valdez. Grew up as a cheerleader while Governor Bill Walker was on the sports team. So a reunion of sorts yesterday.
Yeah.
She's held a number of positions in state government, Department of Community and Regional Affairs, Department of Natural Resources, finished her career at Natural Resources as the commissioner. So worked closely with this article. She's also a former trustee of the Alaska Permanent Fund, the beneficiary of our resource development. So let me turn now to Marty.
Thank you. And thank you guys for being here this morning. It's nice to see you here again today. It's been a great conference so far. So I just want to follow on something John said. He referenced, getting to sit at the knees of these great people who crafted our Constitution and basically became the leaders of our state. And I had that same opportunity, not from the legislative perspective, but my father also was born and raised in Valdez and was a great friend of a lot of these guys, one of them being Bill Egan. And Bill, before the Constitutional Convention in 55, 56, was the owner of one of the grocery stores and the butcher. And in those days, everybody had accounts, and mom would say, go down to the grocery store and get a ham or get something like that. And so I got to know Bill very closely that way, but also I was really lucky in that Bill Egan and I share the same birthday, October the 8th. And Dad and he had been great friends growing up, so we always celebrated our birthdays together at either their house, our house, or the Dittman's house. And the wonderful thing about Bill Egan that people talk about all the time is how much he loved people and how good he was at remembering their names and their details on their families. And he was remarkable. And this is one example. From the time he left Valdez, and I'm a little fuzzy on when that was because I was fairly young, and but let's say sometime between 57 and 59. He wrote me either a letter or sent me a telegram every single birthday, which my father took away from me immediately and put into the safe, where they exist to this day. But one year, after we were a state, and he happened to be here in Fairbanks, and he knew there was a National Guard plane coming down to Valdez from Fairbanks. And evidently, I think it was a Chamber of Commerce meeting where when he got there, they had a table-size flat cake that says, "Happy Birthday, Bill." He wouldn't let him cut it, and he sent the entire cake to me on the National Guard plane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Cool.
pretty amazing. I don't even have a picture of that, unfortunately. But as you know, we're here to talk about Title 8 or Article 8 of the Alaska Constitution, and we're really going to hammer away on that key statement that was in the video, and John made reference to it. But I want a couple things I want to add personally. I believe that when the Alaskan delegates gathered here in Fairbanks in that cold winter of 55, 56, they weren't just here to write a constitution. I believe they were here to draft a promise. And I think that promise really basically came alive in the natural resource article. And again, it's very clearly articulated that we as a state were very tired of outside influences coming up here, harvesting our wonderful resources and not leaving anything for the residents. So I want to restate that same key statement in Article 8, and that is that the legislature shall provide for the utilization, development, and conservation of all natural resources belonging to the state for the maximum benefit of its people. It's a very short sentence, and it's a very powerful one. So as people have also said, we had suffered a lot of exploitation. Obviously, the canneries had been building massive fish traps. They were scooping up, tens of thousands of salmon. They were depleting the runs, and they were leaving the locals with just scraps. So by the late 1940s, the cry really throughout the state was abolish the traps. And that was sort of a banner cry. The other thing, though, was the mining. It wasn't like our placer miners that were local, and this was huge mining on a huge scale. And the Kennecott mine, again, owned by the Guggenheim and by Morgan Syndicate, they produced and extracted from Alaska $200 million of copper between 1911 and 1928. In today's dollars, that's worth over $3 billion. $4 billion. Is it 3 or 4? It's
Yeah.
It's somewhere right around the 3 point something. That's a huge amount of money, and we got left with virtually nothing. Timber and coal actually suffered the same influences, and again, they were extracted with leaving virtually nothing for the locals. So basically, when the framers of the Constitution came together here, they said, this is enough. We're done. We're not going to have this anymore. And the resources, we will leave here with the resources being managed for Alaskans, not by absentee corporations, and not have our values stripped out in Seattle and San Francisco and so forth. Personally, I also believe that our delegates were influenced somewhat, well, probably significantly, by some of the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, and the post-war stewardship ideas that had begun to emerge on a national level. Of course, Roosevelt had underpinned the whole effort to try to re-encourage the economy as a result of the Depression and the post-war situations that were, everybody was coming back looking for jobs. They weren't always available. So like the Tanana Valley hydro project that basically was not only the biggest and still is the biggest hydroelectric co-op in the country, but also was all about encourage economic growth. And so I think that also had a huge effect, and it specifically had a huge effect on delegates Vic Fisher, Bill Egan, and George Sundberg. I knew two of the three very well. I did not know George Sundberg, but the other two I'm very fortunate to count as friends. So Vic Fisher was a very young delegate, probably the youngest, I'm not sure about that, but he later was a leading historian, public official, and an author about the convention. And he kept emphasizing the responsibility to future Alaskans, urging that the resource wealth not be consumed all at once. George Sundberg, who had studied other constitutions and helped draft the Alaska model, a constitutional model, argued that Alaska's constitution could be modern and forward-thinking and streamlined. And Bill Egan, who, as you know, was the convention's president and the future first governor of the state, pressed for a very practical approach and consensus. He really believed in consensus, and I think that's why they elected him the president, is because he was so good at creating consensus. Everybody loved him. He was just this remarkably approachable, kind, caring individual. So they didn't always agree, those three, by the way. They actually had some fairly fierce debates, but they did share the vision of Alaska's resources belonging to all Alaskans, future and present, not just one or the other. So they, Article 8 basically provided the foundation for how Alaska began to manage its lands once it became a state. And we received, acreage from the federal government, as well as at that point in time, so did the ENCSA corporations that had been created and so forth and so on. So from that philosophy evolved the Department of Natural Resources Best Interest Findings, the BIFs, if you hear people say that word. That was my home for 20 years, and I've got very strong feelings about what totally committed people have worked in that agency and how committed they are to trying to accomplish what the Constitution demanded. And that is this interests of the people, both current and future. And they struggle mightily to accomplish that. And before the state of Alaska, DNR, can basically sever its relationship, whether that be through leasing land for oil, gas, and mining, as well as land sales or land leasing, they must accomplish a best interest finding on that action. So that's where they take all these interests, the economic interests, the geographic relationships, the cultural interests, and the people's opinions about that action. That is equally as important. And then that is all put into the pot, and out emerges a best interest finding that then the public gets to comment on, and oftentimes it's amended and it eventually emerges in final form, and then the action can occur. So That process is rooted directly in Article 8, and it definitely reflects the framers' insistence that decisions about resources are not just technical and financial, but also civic and constitutional. So the other thing that happened in the 1970s, when oil began flowing out of Prudhoe Bay, Alaskans faced a new challenge. Oil's finite. It is not possible to have sustained yield on it. It is discrete, and once it's extracted or sold, it is gone. So how was the state, and in particular the legislature, going to deal with the fact that the Constitution wanted to ensure that resources be available not only to current Alaskans, but future Alaskans? And so that was the basic premise of the discussion that led to our Alaska Permanent Fund. And the legislature created first the fund, and then a couple years later, the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. And then from that emerged the permanent fund dividends. And all of those pieces are a direct relationship to Article 8 in the Alaska Constitution. So in closing, I just want to say that they not only crafted, the delegates not only crafted a promise, they crafted a covenant that Alaska's resources belong to all Alaskans, not those just alive today, but the future, which we all need to remember. And it shaped the Department of Natural Resources. It shaped and created the Permanent Fund. And if, in fact, each generation takes seriously the responsibility, I believe, of maximum benefit of the people, then we will, over time, continue to re-examine what that looks like in the light of current situations. And if we ask ourselves that question and answer it responsibly, I think that it is going to serve us extremely well going forward another 70, 100 years. So thank you.
Yeah.
Our next panelist is Tim Bradner. Tim's a longtime Alaska journalist, 60 years as a journalist, and really the foremost economic journalist in Alaska. He's currently the co-publisher of the Alaska Legislative Digest and the Alaska Economic Report, and editor of Alaska Inc. magazine. And he took one break from his journalist career and worked in public and legislative relations for BP. So able to watch resource development from two different aspects and then to report on it for years. And if you don't already read the economic report, you probably should, because it's a great publication. Tim?
Thank you for that endorsement, Brian. Is the sound okay? Can everybody hear me? Well, Brian asked me to be on the panel, just to maybe say a few things about how the perspective of people that I was working with in BP, for example, looked at some of these issues that are embodied in the Constitution. But first, I want to just kind of build on something Marty said. The permanent fund and the continuing revenues for it is very much, we have to look at that as deferred oil revenue, continuing flow of oil revenue in another form. It's the earnings in the financial markets, but it's really the basis of it is oil income in the beginning. And of course, most of the income to the fund these days is the earnings in the financial markets, but still it's all started with oil. That was the base of it. So very much, Marty made an excellent point, and that's the way we converted a non-sustaining, non-renewable resource into a ongoing, permanent, sustainable resource. So you really have to hand it to the legislators in 1976 who created it, and quite a few are still around and are still involved in safeguarding the fund. Anyway, on to some of the subjects Brian asked me to talk about. I had the privilege of working for BP from 1970 to 1985, when finally I got fed up with arguments over oil and gas taxation And my wife, Shell, and I went off to graduate school to get a break. And then I came back and started working with my brother Mike on his publications, and we've kind of continued. But it's interesting to sort of think about why in working with BP, right at the beginning, when they first came into Alaska, I started work with them in 1970. And they had been here a few years before, but they were just really getting started. 1969, 1970, staffing up. They were involved in the early pipeline planning. But BP is interesting because it was the company that really led the way to the exploration of the North Slope. They and Sinclair, which is an American company, did a lot of the early exploration, and of course they were building off work that had been done by the USGS and federal geologists, and of course the Army after World War II and the National Petroleum Reserve. But they kind of looked at Alaska in a different way than the American oil companies, which came later in the late 1960s in the Kenai Peninsula. They had more of a at least I always like to think of it, they had more of an international perspective of Alaska. And I think, although they didn't really, I had long conversations with some of those people about these things. And I think the most important thing, of course, is that the reason they're here is because Alaska had good rocks. Without that, nothing happens. So that was most important. But also we had a interesting foundation of government, which they kind of like coming from a different place. You know, early on when they first came here, all the land of the North Slope, which they were interested in, was owned by the federal government. It then became owned by most of the land, a lot of the land by the state, and they liked the idea of dealing with a simplicity of government ownership, which our state constitution provided for. You know, we have a very modern constitution, very simple, authorities concentrated in executive branch, really the governor. Some of us may have concerns about that these days, but any event, it was unlike other states where authority was, there were older constitutions, authority was fractured among many independently elected commissioners. And the things was just doing business in those states was complicated. The land resource, the mineral rights were held by individual ranchers and farmers. Took a lot of time to assemble land packages for these companies. But Alaska was simple. The state owned it all. And you just dealt with the state, and you can cut your deal with the state. You sort of accepted the rules that they set out, and they were quite comfortable with that. And so were other companies too that came to the North Slope. So I think that was an advantage because it grew directly out of our state constitution and the framework for it. The rules were clear. And now later on, there's another part of the Constitution called the taxation chapter, which is different. We got into some big arguments over taxes, which are different than the land ownership and the royalty share, which the simplicity and the security of that was a big draw in the early years. Later, we argued about taxes, and we still do today. But in any event, that led to a good foundation to get the industry started here. Actually, if I can take a minute, Brian, I was going to tell a story about what really led BP to get interested in the North Slope of Alaska. And this is of course secondhand, but I was talking to somebody who really knew this almost firsthand, and it was Roger Herrera, a name that some of you may remember. He was an early geologist for BP and still lives in Anchorage, and very familiar, led a lot of the early exploration. Roger told me a story, and this has been documented in sort of BP's corporate lore, that early on, there was one of BP's directors flying to Tokyo, one of the early transpolar flights, flew from London to Tokyo. They flew right over the North Slope, and he looked out the window, and he said, gee, he looked at the terrain and the land formations and the geology, and that looks a lot like Persia. where BP was very active. That's now Iran. BP was very active, made big discoveries. And he got back to, when he got back to London, he gathered his exploration people and said, look, we should take a look at Alaska. And so they assembled a team, and our friend Roger was assigned to it. He's a young geologist with BP. And he was given the task of with his other colleagues, assessing the North Slope's potential and making recommendations as to whether the company should take leases and start exploring there. But the North Slope was wide. It was a big region, unexplored. The fact that there wasn't a lot of competition yet from other companies was another factor. A sort of interesting perspective that what attracted them was just the sort of the simplicity, the openness of the opportunities, which were created, in effect, indirectly by the framework of the state constitution or organization of our government. By the way, BP eventually got kicked out of Persia, but which is also part of the story too, because that led them to get much more seriously involved about diversifying into the U.S. Anyway, that's my framework, and I can maybe chip into the conversation as we go along. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Tim. And our final panelist, before we get into some dialogue among the panelists, is Doug Pope. Doug's also, like most of the panel, a lifelong Alaskan with a 50-year legal career, litigated several cases involving Article 8, and some of the cases that helped the court define what it meant. He's also served a term on the Alaska Board of Games, so has dealt with the resources issues from several perspectives. Doug.
Can everybody hear me? Well, thank you, Brian, for inviting me on this panel, and thank the audience for sticking with us all this time. So I grew up in Fairbanks. I was 10 when the Constitutional Convention happened. So I was in the 5th grade. I was more maybe cognizant of what was going on than you, John, but I do remember that I didn't get to, some kids got to go up to the convention. I didn't get to go up, but the booby prize for me and for this other girl in my class called Roxanne is we got to raise the American flag while photos were taken during the convention. It was 50 below and there was ice fog, and so we had trouble with the rope getting, because it was frozen, the snaps were frozen, and Roxanne solved the problem by taking her mittens off and thawing out the brass snaps so we could get the flag in. And then they played the national anthem and we rose the flag. So that's my memory of the convention. I went on to, and I talked to Gary Stevens about this earlier. So I graduated from high school, went to U of A here. I'm a U of A graduate. And I was able to go to law school because at the time there was this student loan program that was designed to encourage kids to come back to Alaska, and with a 40% forgiveness if you came back and lived for 5 years. And so that's the only reason I was able to afford to go to law school. I was working construction in the summer, but law school was expensive. So when I got back here, I worked in the public defender's office for a while, and then I went into private practice. And one of the first things I realized in really reviewing the Constitution was that there have been very few cases interpreting the natural resources article. And so that just grasped my attention, because someone talked about cases of first impression here earlier. That's what that means, that every case was a case of first impression. There hadn't been any other cases defining that. And so I got involved in some cases. And I would like to make and I'm going to talk about one in just a second, but I would like to make a friendly amendment to what you quoted, John, is because the Constitution does say maximum use,
Yep.
but it says maximum use consistent with the public interest.
Right.
And so that clause came to the head in a case involving oil leases in Kachemak Bay. And that's a 50-year-old case now. So a lot of people don't remember that, but Egan, one of his last acts as governor before he lost to Jay Hammond, was his Department of Natural Resources approved oil leases for Kachemak Bay, and it became a huge issue in the state. Even here in Fairbanks, people were hauling truckloads of shrimp and crab from the Kenai Peninsula to Fairbanks to hold crab and shrimp feeds to raise money to pay for opposing that oil lease. And so it was a big deal in Alaska's consciousness at the time. And I was fortunate enough to get involved in a case that ended up going to the Alaska Supreme Court in 1975. It was the first case I argued at the Alaska Supreme Court. There was another better lawyer than me in the case. Skip Matthews, he went on to become Chief Justice of the Alaska Supreme Court. But the case, Marty talked about a best interest finding, and at that point in time, a statute said that the director had to find that it was in the best interest of the state to issue oil leases. I'm paraphrasing a bigger statute. Well, the question was, what did that mean? And did he have to actually make a written finding, or did he even have to make a finding at all? Did he just have to believe that it was in the best interest of the state? Well, the case became a big case, and Jay Rabinowitz, we've heard about him today, wrote one of the majority opinions. There were two opinions. And what Justice Rabinowitz found was that the section I just quoted you from Article 8 was meant that there had to be some determination that it was in the best interest of the state that there was a decision made. And so they interpreted that statute broadly, and they concluded that the director had not made that proper decision. They didn't second guess his opinion on it. They just said he didn't bother to do it at all. And so the case was sent back to the trial court, and that gave the legislature time to buy back the oil leases in Kachemak Bay. And that is the basis for the best interest findings that Marty was talking about. And they talked about how important the natural resources, or the framers felt about natural resources, the disposition and development in the state. And so that was I kind of look at the Constitution as Article 8 is aspirational. This is what we aspire to. And that I agree with John and Marty that has led, sort of been the framework for the guidance for developing the state. But the Constitution has also been a check upon executive and legislative powers, and that check has come through the judicial branch of government. And the Kachemak Bay oil lease case was an example of that. Right. So I went on to, as Brian noted, argue a number of cases before the Alaska Supreme Court that had to do with Article 8. And my conclusion is that it is, and just give you the basis for my conclusion, I've read every word in the minutes of the Constitutional Convention that it comes to Article 8. And you saw on the film here, the little room that the Committee on Natural Resources met in. I've also read all of the minutes of that committee and all the amendments. I read all the amendments that were ever made in the committee. I saw the committee votes. And I had to do that in order to be prepared to argue a case before the Alaska Supreme Court. So, but my conclusion is that it is one of a crowning achievement of the convention. And John, your dad deserves a lot of credit for that. I know you must have felt proud when you saw your mom and your dad up here on the screen. And I feel proud for you, to tell you the truth.
Thank you.
And I know that Marty has spent the best part of her career trying to deal with lawyers.
Yeah. Oh, man.
And which always get a bad rap, and deservedly so in a lot of cases. But like I said, I believe that it was a model article, and it will, along with the decisions from the Alaska Supreme Court, will help us guide in the future. I agree with Tim that the permanent fund was essentially, even though it's in a different article of the Constitution, in many ways it supplements Article 8 because it gave the state a way to set aside revenues from the oil development for the future benefit of the people. And that was consistent with the language of the Article 8 that John and Marty have been talking about. So I was fortunate enough to be in a staff person in the legislature when the permanent fund amendment went to the floor of the legislature and passed. And then and I was fortunate enough to work, I think, with Brian also on the special committee on the permanent fund that came up with the management structure, which I'll always remember Ed Dankworth coming into our office and saying, "How did you guys come up with a bill that was so conservative?" Because it was a liberal caucus in the House, but the caucus was convinced that it was important to save money, take it out of the hands of the legislature, because there was a worry at the time that they would spend it all if it wasn't set aside. So I'll reserve any further comments for any questions, but thank you today for being here.
Well, thanks, Doug. And I'll have a few questions for the panel, and then if we have time, open up to the audience as a whole. But first, for Tim, Terrence Cole said the article was written to reverse the tide of Alaskan economic history, so that Alaskans would gain control. To what extent do you think we were successful in reversing the tide of Alaska's economic history?
Well, first I have to, is this on?
Yeah.
I was remembering, how do I turn this thing on again? Well, I think the tides of history have changed, and I mentioned earlier the taxation article has resulted in changes in oil taxes over the years that have resulted in a lot of revenues coming into the state. The landowner share, the royalty, which of course is set up in a framework in Article 8, is fixed, because once a lease is set, it's a contract and it doesn't change. So a lot of the oil leases in the most parts of the North Slope are the old oil leases that were issued in 1964, 65. And those terms have never changed. But what the legislature, I mentioned periodically we have these big fights over oil revenues and taxes, and that comes under the tax aspect. And there was a feeling in the legislature that they would, we hear a lot about the arguments over the fair share. What's our fair share of the resources? course, that's all in the eye of the beholder, but it was through the tax mechanism that the share of the state of the resource, which many over the years have felt have been inadequate, was reversed. So in that sense, the tides have changed. And that argument is still going on, by the way. I hope that addressed.
Yeah. Well, speaking of arguments that are continuing to go on, the question of that many feel there's conflict between ANILCA federal law and Article 8, the reservation to the people for common use. And I'll ask if anybody wants to speak to that issue at all. John, I know you have some strong feelings on that.
So in my time in the legislature, we get to see that come running into us, but it's also something that we promised we would do during the Constitutional Convention. That was, we would settle the Aboriginal issue in Alaska. And ANCSA came about because of that. During the ANCSA debate, we tried to figure out what was the best structure that the natives here would live with and the people of Alaska could agree on. During that debate, the D2 thing came up, which was a D2 section of the ANCSA law that said, we've got to figure out how we're going to deal with the resources in Alaska. Now, I might be off a little bit on that, but I can tell you, ANILCA came along to solve that resource problem. It was a big debate. I can't go into all of it because it was a little bit beyond my time, but I will tell you this. The 3 laws in Alaska that govern what we do in Alaska, our Constitution, no doubt, sets a stage. And then the Alaska Native Land Claim Settlement became a contemporary law with that. In that, we had to figure out how are we going to live with the national interest that Alaska gets what, 100 and some million acres, and the rest belongs to the United States. And so the Alaska National Interest lands are managed by Congress. And quite frankly, they came in contracts with each other in many ways. So the debate came on how we as a people of Alaska would manage our game, our resource management, and who would have access to them. And we were promised access to federal lands. And then under the Jimmy Carter years, I think the Antiquities Act came in to be, which kind of put a lot of tension in it. I remember in my day, I would deliver fuel to miners who were complaining significantly about they were on federal land and now they're being kicked off. Those were big, big days back in the 80s. And it just changed the way our Constitution hit the ground in Alaska. So I would say the tension was high and there were people who drew swords at each other. There's no doubt. I got to see the effect of it. I wasn't in on it. I got to hear Dad talk about it, I can tell you that. But defending our Constitution and our right to manage our land came down to, can you manage your fish and game properly? And we lost some of that under those laws. And so in the legislature, when it was my turn in the legislature, we would push up against that as much as we could. So there's a practical, everyday application of how you manage your fish, your game, and your land management.
Any of the other panelists want to tackle that issue? Doug?
Yeah, I agree with everything you say, John. Might surprise you, but you know, I know some people are aware that I ended up with a case that involved ANILCA and went to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, and so I ended up doing my compulsive thing. I read the entire congressional record on ANILCA. Which took me about a month.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to decide if there actually was a case or not, and I, at the time ANILCA was moving its way through Congress, I was very conflicted because I had grown up in the time when there was just open public land. And as long as you, sort of the ethic, at least in my household, is that as long as you use the land, then you could just use it. And that of course changed. That was I remember very well the land freeze that happened in 1965. I was 20 years old and I was looking for homestead land, and all of a sudden Secretary Udall issued the land freeze. And so then it was like there were some exemptions to that, and there were, you know, up on the Ambler River and on the Metlazitna River, there were exemptions, but they were way away from any, you know, population center. It made it very difficult. So I was conflicted, but I came to conclude that the people of the United States had an interest in Alaska that had to be dealt with. And I think that you conceded that yourself, right? And I wasn't at the time happy with all the parks and reserves that came out of it. But in the, was it 40 years now? Is that how long it's been since Anilka passed? 45. In that 45 years, I've come to believe that in many ways, it was a good thing that happened. I'm not happy with the case that I had and was involved with the Yukon Charlie, the Upper Yukon, and I think the Park Service went overboard. They sort of militarized the river, but the case that got decided in the U.S. Supreme Court, I think my wife and I and my youngest son floated the Yukon, the Upper Yukon, the 2 years after that case was decided. And the whole military presence had been withdrawn from the river. And so I think that there's going to be more litigation. I know there is on the lower Kuskokwim right now, and it's going to be decided by the courts. And I believe that the courts are going to adjust the excesses of the federal government that they can adjust, that were left by ambiguities by in Anilka. But overall, I've concluded that that the parks were a good thing. The exception I would say to that is that I agree with whoever's read, who's read Dan O'Brien's book, The Land Gone Lonesome? Oh, Dan O'Neill, I'm sorry. I absolutely agree with the premise of that book, is that it was a tragedy that the people who were living on the land were kicked off the land, right, because they didn't have a permit from the federal government. To me, that's the main tragedy of Anilka, is that those people, that thing that we grew up with in Alaska, the loners that lived out, or the families that lived out on the land, were excluded from the land. And my belief is that the Park Service misapplied the intentions of Anilka. But I have to fault Senator Stevens and who was it, Gravel at the time, because they didn't pick up on that. They did not pick up how weak the language was in Anilka, who was trying to protect the people who were living on the land. And that gave the Park Service an opening to basically exclude them. So that's sort of my general thoughts about Anilka, but I really agree with you that it effectively amended Article 8 of the Constitution.
Tim?
I turned it off. I managed to turn it off. Now it's on. This is an interesting conversation with Doug, looking at kind of a broad historical perspective on these three acts, these Anilka and the and ANCSA. And I've always been sort of intrigued and impressed by the sort of the intertwining nature of this, the sequence of events that one led to the other. You know, we started with the Alaska Statehood Act, which created, of course, the state and the state's land rights in what had previously been public domain. The entire state belonged to the federal government. So you had the state had the right to go and select lands and own part of those lands, including, of course, the North Slope. Well, that helped really put fuel behind the native claims movement in the 1960s. The Alaska Native people woke up to the fact that, whoops, somebody is taking land and we're not going to have a part of it. Right. It's going to be the state of Alaska, not, you know, the traditional inhabitants and people who lived in villages. So that really really fueled the land claims movement. And I remember particularly the Arctic Slope people were just incensed that the state was selling oil leases around Prudhoe Bay, and they felt that was their land, and many of them still do. In any event, the Claims Act passed and was mentioned by Doug and John. Parts of the Claims Act dealt with the national interest, which was the Section 17D2. So that then led to ANILCA being passed. So anyway, there was a kind of a sequence, a linkage between these things, which is just intriguing how interesting way public policy is made. So just a thought.
We have about Marty, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. I just want to clarify that it's important for people to understand that ANCSA and ANILCA certainly have affected our ability to manage our lands, which we received about 105 million acres. But it did not change the fundamental approach and interest of the people and both immediate and long-term generations. It certainly impinges on some of our locations, sometimes access, for instance. Right. And then, of course, navigable waters, which often flow through the middle of navigable waters, are owned by the waters, and the water beds are owned by the state. So sometimes the management strategies of the federal agencies impose on our ability to accurately or effectively manage our lands. But it has not changed completely the fundamental rights and obligations of the state on how to manage that land. I will also say that the thing that gets a little confusing for everybody, and it's important to know, is the state got to select lands and we got to over-select lands, and the same thing can be said for the ANCSA corporations. They too got to select lands, and their land selections took general priority over the states in general, not always, but in general. And so that's why the state of Alaska nor the corporations have ever completely completed the process of selections, because everybody's sort of waiting for everybody else to finalize their selections so our over selections can fall into place and we know what we have, because we want to prioritize what's left as in terms of values. So those are both aspects of the complexities of those three laws interacting.
We have about 10 minutes left. We'll take questions from the audience. I just ask people to be brief in their questions so we can handle as many as possible.
Thank you all for a very stimulating conversation. I was particularly moved, Marty, by something that you said, and Doug, you reiterated on about, you know, the language, the maximum use consistent with the public interest and for the maximum benefit of the people. And Marty, what you're saying is it's not just our generation, it's future generations to come. And I'll say as a professor here talking to young folks are really worried about climate change.
About what?
Climate change.
Oh.
And I'm wondering how you all think about our rights and our obligations under Article 8, especially with us as an oil state, right? We've extracted over 20 billion barrels of oil since 1957. And we know that this is affecting us today. And so how do you think about Article 8 in the context of anthropogenic climate change and the future of how we manage that as a state, especially because Article 8 was written to think about sustainable resources, and that global climate pollution is often undermining Alaska's sustainable resources.
Mm. Can I take a shot at it?
Marty and then Doug.
So when I left DNR, we still had not begun to embed our best interest findings with any climate data analysis. But it was beginning to emerge through the public comments. And we were struggling. And that's one thing I want to reiterate. Best interest findings evolve. I mean, they've definitely evolved because of litigation decisions. And, they've become more complex and more extensive. But it's a constant thing. Like on climate change, we were struggling when I left with what can we access that will be good data, and how do we at DNR interpret this yet sometimes unanalyzed data, scientific data that is being referred to by the public. And so I do think that that's probably how it's going to initially emerge, is through the public input. How the agencies, and because we do look to our sister agencies sometimes, for, like particularly Fish and Game, for expertise on how they're viewing it and how they're applying it. So I think that's a yet to be determined outcome.
Doug and then John.
Just briefly, the Alaska Supreme Court has expressly held that the language consistent with the public interest is defined by the legislature and by the administrative or the executive branch of government. So what I would say to your students is get involved. And because if climate change is an issue in their mind, and it's going to affect it's definitely affecting the land. To what extent it's going to be affecting the resources of that land is still up for grabs to figure that out. But the way to do that is to get involved through the political process and help define what the public interest is going to be in the future.
So just to add on to that, in the legislature, we dealt with it in a variety of different ways, every way from resolutions to how do we anticipate some of the changes. Part of that is how do we listen to our federal partners, because they have so much of the land that is going to be affected by it, and then our game management. So the tension between the federal and state game management is certainly there, but the climate change issues become a real issue on flora, fauna, and things like that in our streams. And so we did talk about it a lot, and I can tell you it's just incrementally changing, trying to make aware of how you use land management, what do you do for leases and things like that. So they're small, but and I can tell you the argument on quantity plus quality is still an ongoing discussion on what does climate change do to the flora fauna at this point. So it's an open discussion, but I know it's happening.
We have a question online.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, that's fabulous. I love the technology. I want to I thank you for the panel. I also enjoyed seeing the film where I saw so many old friends who are no longer with us, who worked on the Constitution, and who I had an opportunity to work with most of them. I wanted to bring the discussion to, obviously we love and admire the Constitution, but it's not a perfect document. In particular, the resources article had a provision of no exclusive right to fisheries, which was based on the White Act that had, it allowed these fish traps to exist. And so the no exclusive right to fisheries had to be amended in 1972 because it was leading to, overuse of the salmon fisheries. And we created limited entry in 72 by amending the Constitution to fix that, which turned out to be a pretty serious flaw. And I guess my question goes to the discussion you had a moment ago about ANCSA and ANILCA, which I think pointed up another flaw, which was that there was virtually no Alaska Native participation in the Constitutional Convention. There was only one Alaska Native member, and he really didn't speak in terms of Native interests. And the only debate about Native lands or Native resources was brought up by Muktuk Marston and didn't really lead to anything. There's no Native mention of Native lands or resources in the natural resource article, which seems like, from today's perspective, seems like an extraordinary oversight that in some sense, ANCSA and ANILCA kind of had to address, but we never really have managed to get the Constitution to align with ANILCA because we still have no recognition of a rural subsistence preference. So I guess I'd like to ask if any of the members of the panel want to talk about that. Was that an error? Was that an oversight in the Constitution? Is that something that we should still fix?
Doug, are you going to take a shot at that?
Doug?
My impression is it wasn't an error. My impression was that the framers, like I said, I read the entire record. My impression was that the framers, there were two things that were going on in their mind because they paid a lot of attention to Muktuk Marston and his effort to try to resolve the Native claims during the convention. But they thought that that was a federal question and that it would be resolved that way. But they also felt it was very important to treat all Alaskans alike, and including the Native people of Alaska. So, I mean, if you look at the, what's the section that hasn't been discussed yet, Section 3, whenever occurring in their natural state, fish, wildlife, and waters are reserved to the people for the common use. That has been since interpreted by the Alaska Supreme Court as establishing a trust concept into to the management of at least renewable resources. And that trust concept encompasses all people in Alaska, including Alaska Natives as beneficiaries of that trust. So I don't think there was a mistake. I just think that that's how they looked at it at the time. Yes, of course, the common use clause of the Constitution is in conflict with the rural subsistence priority in ANILCA. And that's one way that ANILCA amended our Constitution effectively. I don't think the Constitution needs to be changed. I just think we need to live up to the fact that there's going to be a dual management system in Alaska.
I'd like to be able to continue this conversation, but we have unfortunately reached the end of our time. I'd like you to thank the panelists for their participation, and we'll be around for questions.
You guys.